Hi, I'm Peter Singer. I'm a professor of bioethics at Princeton University and the author of a recent book called The Life You Can Save, Acting Now to End World Poverty. And we're going to be talking about international aid and global poverty.
I should introduce myself now. Hi, Peter. I'm Bill Easterly. I'm professor of economics at New York University. I'm the author of The White Man's Burden, How the West's Efforts to Aid the Rest Have Done So Much Ill and So Little Good. And my area that I work on is foreign aid and its effects, especially in Africa. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Well, I'll be interested to see how much we agree about and how much we disagree about, because I think in reading your books, Bill, you do have a concern for the poor, the world's poorest people. I'm focusing on those who the World Bank defined as living in extreme poverty. So just for those who are not familiar, that's the purchasing power equivalent of $1.25 US per day. It's really not the currency equivalent, but what would purchase the same amount as that in the United States. So it's really incredibly little for affluent people. And I think in reading your work, we would both like to help as many people get out of that extreme poverty as possible.
Absolutely.
Right. So I'm an advocate of people giving more to aid organizations. I think that although certainly the rich nations have done something, we haven't really done very much in comparison to the wealth we have. The amount that we give, I think, is still quite small compared to our capacity to give. I do, of course, think it's important that we should give to organizations that are effective, and that we should evaluate organizations to make sure that they're effective, because I don't believe in just giving for its own sake. I don't believe that somehow it's morally virtuous for us to give, so we write the checks, and where we write them to doesn't matter. I think it matters crucially where we write them to. Yeah.
So I think so far we're all in agreement on everything you've said. I think the question is going to be how much emphasis we put on these two issues. I remember very much, Peter, the metaphor you gave at the beginning of your book about the drowning child. Do you mind giving that metaphor again? Because that really helps, I think, kind of crystallize the thinking.
Okay, fine. So at the start of the book, to get people to think about whether we have an obligation to help, including helping people who are not our family or friends and whose problems we're not responsible for, I ask the reader to imagine that they're walking across a park and there's a shallow pond in the park, and they see a small child who's fallen into the pond and is splashing around, apparently in danger of drowning. So they look around, you say, where's the parents of the child, where's the babysitter? But you can't see anyone. It seems like there's only you and the child. So you can rush into the pond and pull out the child, and if you do, you'll very probably save the child's life. But there is some cost to that. Perhaps you're going to ruin the expensive pair of shoes that you put on that morning and that you don't have time to take off. So it's going to cost you a couple of $100 maybe to replace those shoes. So I asked the reader, suppose that you said, oh, I'm not responsible for this child. I didn't push the child into the pond. So why should I ruin my shoes? I'll just walk on and forget about the child. Would you think that that's an okay thing to do? Would that be morally acceptable to forget about the child because you didn't want to ruin your shoes? And I think most readers, certainly most students that I've asked, because I often ask this of my classes, they say, no, that would be wrong. You can't compare the cost of a pair of shoes, even the most expensive shoes you own, to a child's life. So I use that example to say, if you agree with that, it seems that you do agree we have some obligation to help to save someone who's in danger of dying, where you could save them at a relatively modest but not completely trivial cost. And if that's so, I then say, well, what are you doing about global poverty? Because I do believe that you can, at, again, relatively modest, though not trivial cost, contribute to an organization that has a good chance of saving a child's life, or perhaps helping someone to get out of poverty, transforming someone's life even if they're not going to die, transforming their life from one that's really completely lacking in what we would regard as the minimum basic necessities for a decent life, and put somebody above that level where they can live a decent life and start to do the things that we think a human life should be able to include.
Yeah, Peter, that's one of the best metaphors I've ever heard. That's a great metaphor. It's very compelling. It's very powerful. At the same time, I find it in addressing it to the issue of world poverty, it's misleading in one very important way, which is that in our situation, trying to help a poor person, what we're actually doing is we're not physically able to rush in ourselves and save the child. In fact, we are not even able to observe whether the child is saved or not. What we are doing is we're sending money off to someone else on the other side of the world, some intermediary, an NGO or an official aid agency, and we're, counting on them to save the child. And so, I guess to put the metaphor another way, if your person who is saving a child was in a situation that for some reason they were physically unable to help, and they knew they had to delegate it to someone else, then it would also be morally reprehensible if they did not find a person who was reliable, who they were sure was going to save the child. And it would be morally reprehensible if they did not, in fact, check up to make sure that the child was saved. But that would be just as morally objectionable as your situation of, yourself directly failing to rush to the aid of the child. And it's the second moral issue and ethical issue and economic issue that really energizes me, just because I think that's where the real disconnect is in both the NGO world and the foreign aid world. That we have intermediaries that we really don't know what they're doing, and that we really don't bother checking up on. It seems to be a law of human nature that we can sort of only concentrate on one thing at a time. So it seems like we either concentrate on the giving issue, which is your issue, or on the accountability issue. And what I observe in practice is almost everyone concentrates on the giving issue. And there's very, very little attention paid to the accountability issue, which is the second one, which is, did this intermediary fail to save the child? Which would be morally reprehensible on us as the donors if we failed to ensure that. It would also be morally reprehensible for the intermediary to take our money and then fail to do that. And yet, that unfortunately does happen in the real world, and that's a compelling issue that I feel like really needs a lot more attention.
Yeah, good. I think that's a very nice play on the original child in the pond metaphor, a way of extending it and illustrating the point that you want to make. Just perhaps to get clear about exactly where you think the disconnect is, let me put to you a question that I've been asked when I've been doing some promotion for the book, For the Life You Can Save. I do, for example, callback radio programs, and very often I get somebody calling in and saying, I'm not going to give to these organizations because I don't think any of the money really gets to the people who need it. I think it gets swallowed up by the bureaucracy that is used in administration and so on, and doesn't really get to where it's needed. Now, is that for you the problem, or is there a different problem from that one?
And that's one of many possible problems that would cause the disconnect, that it's swallowed up by the bureaucracy. It could just be plain incompetence on the part of the organization. Sometimes it's just a lack of knowledge on how to solve the problem. Because I think the other thing that is a little misleading about your really compelling metaphor is that in this case, it's very obvious what you need to do to save the child. You rush in and you grab the child physically and lift the child out of the water. You pound them on the stomach or the chest, and we know what to do. But it's not so clear when you're dealing with, a child who's suffering from a combination of malnutrition and malaria on the other side of the world, which involves a mixture of their parents not feeding them the right combination of food, not enough food, not enough usage or access to bed nets. And then, figuring out how to make those systems work, it's not an easy problem. And I think that's the other thing that is, the emphasis on giving and the way in which that message can make the problem sound easy is actually very misleading and can lead to a lot of disillusionment, because what people have to know is that this is a very hard problem to solve, to get aid money from us to solve the problems of people on the other side of the world. And so we're going to have to work very hard at making sure that these organizations are able to complete the chain and save the child. It's going to be a combination of, evaluating them to see what they actually do, and just but also acknowledging that they themselves are working in a very difficult environment where the results are uncertain. It's not the simple environment where you rush in and snatch the child out of the water. It's more like you're trying to coordinate the actions and motivate and incentivate the actions of 45 different people involved in saving a child.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so of course I agree it is just a metaphor and it is far too simple. Obviously, metaphors don't present all the complexities of the real world. I started off with a question about, is it that the money gets used administratively? Because I have had a look at the organizations that I talk about in the book and that I give to. I talk about Oxfam, for example. I mean, it's an international organization, not really just one, but I've had experience with Oxfam in Great Britain, with Oxfam Australia, and now with Oxfam America. And I think, I can say of that organization and of a few others, that is not the case that they're just using up most of the money in their own internal administration. Certainly if you look at their accounts, we're talking about maybe 80 to 85% of the money going to the programs. So you could still raise a question, of course, about are the programs well-directed? Are they effective? And I do want to talk a bit more about that and about evaluating them. I think that's very important. But I think there are organizations that at least you can be confident that they're not just taking it all for themselves. They're not just fat cats that are enriching themselves from the money that we're giving them.
I'm not tarring with a broad brush every organization. I'm saying you have to differentiate, and we need a culture of accountability that does differentiate, that really demands to know whether the money in fact saves the child.
So one other thing that I do in the book then is I talk about a relatively new organization called GiveWell.net.
I'm familiar with that.
Right, and this is a couple of guys who were working for a hedge fund a few years back, when I guess hedge funds were more universally profitable than they have been in the last year or so. And they were making quite a lot of money at that hedge fund, and they decided that they wanted to give some of that away. And so, together with some others there, they formed a group to say, well, who should we give to? And they were used to evaluating corporations. That was their job. Which corporations are effective in terms of achieving what they're setting out to achieve, which is ultimately generating profits for investors. And what they discovered when they looked around and wrote to some organizations and said, tell us what you do, set out your case, was that they just got promotional material which showed nice photos of happy kids or something, and didn't really give them the information that they wanted. So they invited organizations to really demonstrate that they were being effective in achieving their goals, to really be transparent in what they were doing. And not very many organizations actually have passed their scrutiny. They haven't. Some of them are perhaps a bit too big and complicated for them to scrutinize, but they have, I looked at their website just before coming on here, they've examined over 300 organizations, and I think they've got 9 that they're recommending on their website at givewell.net that they are recommending. They start with an organization called Village Reach, which helps to make sure that life-saving medicines travel the last mile, as they say, to the villages where they're needed. They recommend a Stop Tuberculosis partnership. They recommend Population Services International, which distributes condoms and malaria bed nets and so on. So I'm wondering what you think about that. If you were to say to someone,
I think
well, here are some people
they
who are trying to
recommended
do
the Global
this.
Fund also, didn't they?
That's true. Yes,
Yeah.
they recommended the Global Fund.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. Is this something that is this the kind of thing that you think we need more of? Is this?
Oh yeah,
is this
absolutely. I mean,
giving
this
us answers to the.
Yeah, I mean, we need a lot more of this. And, I think I see the problem beginning at a very basic level, that the political climate or the sort of climate among the donors is still not creating enough demand for services like that. So I think, the first task for all of us is really just to convince the public that this kind of service is critical to making sure that our money does indeed save children. And, it's only when there's sort of enough of an upswelling of demand from donors that for these kind of organizations that we're going to get enough of them. It's sort of not enough for the hedge fund guys to decide on their own to offer the service. There has to be a huge demand for it. And so far I don't see that demand, frankly. And that's what I keep, myself trying to campaign for and write about, and other like-minded people are campaigning for that. So that's item one. Item
Right.
2 is, we really need sort of multiple organizations of this type, doing lots and lots of investigating and checking up on each other as well as on the organizations they are checking on. The reason I mentioned the Global Fund with GiveWell is I thought that was a bad call, actually. I think the Global Fund has gotten a lot of well-deserved criticism on AIDS in particular for really neglecting the prevention issues in AIDS and, letting their focus on treatment, which is a good cause, but letting the treatment of people who are already HIV positive crowd out their efforts on prevention, and really, really dropped the ball on prevention. And that's the kind of big issue that somehow got missed in their methodology. And so I'm not really intending to target them in particular. I think they're doing some good things too, but it's just to highlight the importance that we have lots of organizations like this checking up. There's another one that I think is a really good one, a website that's called Good Intentions Are Not Enough, it's really a one-man operation by one-woman operation, I should say, but a woman has a lot of NGO experience and just writes lots of really great common sense stuff about what kinds of efforts are good and what kind of efforts are not so good and what are the kind of things you should look for in every NGO. So that's another one I'd recommend. But we just need lots more of these.
Good Intentions Are Not Enough, is that right?
It's called, the website is called Good Intentions Are Not Enough, yeah.
Okay, I haven't looked at that one,
Yeah.
So I'll take a look at that as well. But I certainly, agree with you, and it's good to find this agreement that it's true in my book I did mostly focus on saying people could give more, we have an obligation to give more, but I certainly did devote a chapter to evaluation and talked about GiveWell and also talked about the work of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT who are also trying to do evaluation. So I would like to support your call for a public that is more demanding about the standards required for the organizations to be worthy of donating to.
Yeah, let me give you an example, Peter, that I just ran across recently. There is a new ad that is one of the best ads I've ever seen, except the message it sends is completely misleading and wrong. There's an ad showing a couple dining in an affluent restaurant. This is on a website called skip1.org. And the waitress brings this, table plates of really nice food, and the couple at the table say, "Well, I think we're going to skip this one." And then you see the waitress say, okay, you're going to skip it. And then you see the waitress sort of walk out of the restaurant, and then she's suddenly in a poor village, and she's carrying the same food, the same meal, to children in a poor village. And so the website is asking you to give up something in order to feed a hungry child in a poor village. And so their slogan is "Skip a meal, save a child." That's the best promotional video I've ever seen. Except,
yeah, it's like what my mother used to say, right?
Yeah,
you know, eat up, don't leave it on your plate.
Right,
There's hungry children in China, or whatever, right?
Except, of course, again, we have the problem that we don't have a waitress who can walk directly, from one world to the other with our plates.
Right.
And in fact, what the organization that this video was supporting is actually an organization that does give free meals to hungry children, but that actually is not their main business. It turns out, among other things. And of course, your donation doesn't go directly to one identifiable child. That's a common misconception in a lot of these aid campaigns. The real problem is that their main business is doing some other stuff that is not very effective, such as giving used clothing to people in poor countries. And that's something that this website that I advertise, Good Intentions Are Not Enough, identifies as one of the least effective forms of NGO aid, is giving used clothing, because the transportation costs just eat up, the value of the clothing does not have very high value. It eats up all the value of the clothing you're trying to ship to the other side of the world, and it also drives out of business the local manufacturers of textiles, and so in some sense makes the whole situation worse, possibly. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm just giving this as an example that, once you see a really motivational ad like that, it's so brilliant at getting people to give, but then you have to take the next step at, digging into what you're giving. And you can find some stuff that needs to be caught. And, the fact that this kind of stuff is still appearing in a really high-profile campaign is just a sign of how much we still lack the culture of accountability. If you want to read more about this story, we wrote this up on I'm myself trying to do one of these efforts to keep tabs on aid. I run a blog called Aid Watch. The website is aidwatchers.com. And you can read about that particular story on our blog. It was written by Diane Bennett, one of our staff members.
Right. So I think we agree with that. We agree that people ought to be scrutinizing aid agencies more, demanding more transparency, having a variety of organizations that are doing more to check up that the aid actually is effective. Do you think there's you're writing a blog about it, we're talking about it. Are there other particular things that people should be doing to help to spread this message, to get more donors to think about aid effectiveness before they write the checks?
Well, I mean, the usual advice in any business is go where the money is. Most of the money in aid is actually going through official aid. And official aid really sadly lacks accountability for results. The current kind of newsworthy example being the USAID program in Afghanistan, which has been just an unmitigated disaster. It's been lost in corruption. The budget has been eaten up by security costs trying to protect the aid workers. USAID has managed it in a very incompetent way. It's probably because they've just been overwhelmed with the volume of money that they're trying to give to Afghanistan. They delegate it to contractors who have then been caught spending the money on something else, or just wasting the money altogether. These things they've been caught over and over again doing incredibly wasteful and almost borderline corrupt things with aid money in Afghanistan. And these stories have been reported in USA Today and all kinds of mass media. And yet there has been. Can you think of any outcry, Peter, about U.S. aid to Afghanistan? Is there anyone talking?
I can't say that.
Can you think of some kind of high-profile figure who has taken up the cause of the tragedy of the lost aid effort to Afghanistan? That billions have gone down in Afghanistan without improving the the well-being of the population, and that's part of the tragic situation that we're in now. That's...
Yeah. Well, that certainly is tragic, because I know when I talk to my students about aid, sometimes they say, well, we're already giving through our government. And firstly, they have an inflated view as to how much aid the United States gives. Secondly, they don't realize, I think, how much U.S. aid is politically targeted.
Yeah,
So I show them this table, which shows that the number one recipient of U.S. aid is Iraq, and Afghanistan is number two.
Yeah,
so obviously
and Pakistan is up there too, yeah.
Yeah, Pakistan is well up there as well. So obviously we're giving the money to where we think it will do us the most good in the world, as well as where it might do some good. And if, in fact, we're putting so much money into Afghanistan, and I'm not sure what you think about our aid effort in Iraq, but I imagine that's also a case where we're putting...
a disaster, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that is a tragedy, because it means that even the U.S. is actually really doing even less for the world's poorest people than the amount of aid that we give, which I think was something like 16 or 18 cents in every $100 that we earn over the last year or so. Then we're really giving even less than that to the poor. So I agree there should certainly be more attention focused on that.
Yeah.
I thought you probably know more about this than I do. I thought that the Obama administration has set up some kind of review of U.S. aid and looking again at its priorities and how it's given.
Oh yeah, there's been a task force working away at this. But they're stuck in sort of the bureaucratic and political morass of Washington trying to fix these problems. USAID has got all kinds of interest groups that it's trying to satisfy, and the beneficiaries of USAID are certainly the least powerful of the interest groups that they're trying to satisfy. In fact, I'd say they have no power whatsoever over USAID.
Right. So what it needs is people speaking up for them, obviously.
Right. Like another tragic example is Tide aid that USAID is sending food shipments to the Sahel region or the Horn of Africa, where there's currently a possible famine developing. But according to U.S. law, they have to buy the corn in Nebraska and ship it on U.S. ships. It takes 6 months. In the meantime, people are dying. There's a story in the news of an Ethiopian grandfather who watched his grandchildren die as he was waiting for the U.S. food shipments to arrive from Nebraska on these shipping lines that charge 50% more than commercial rates to the U.S. government to ship this food. And the obvious thing to do would be to buy the food locally, stimulate local agriculture. There is plenty of food available in the region that you can buy and get right away to the people to avoid famine. And the USAID refuses to do that for political reasons, because they want to satisfy some senator from Nebraska.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of the organizations are alert to that, right? I saw last year that CARE refused to distribute U.S. food aid because of that issue. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's a backlash, I hope, is starting to form against that. But again, that's the fact that there is not more of an outcry on something that is so obviously wrong, that there would not be enough of a political lobby in the U.S. that would care enough about hungry children dying because of a 6-month delay just to satisfy a senator from Nebraska. Can't we get a political lobby going that would be more powerful than one senator from Nebraska to overturn this ridiculous practice?
Yes, I would certainly hope we could, and I would support efforts to do that. I believe that Oxfam America is one of the organizations that's lobbying for this kind of reform in aid. So I think that's one way in which the public can get involved by asking those aid organizations. There are probably others, I'm not sure, but I know that Oxfam is one, to what they can do to help their aid efforts, and to contact their congressional representatives, I guess, and say, we really should be not looking after the interests of corn growers in Nebraska, but the people who need the assistance and need it immediately.
Right.
I do worry, though. I mean, I accept these problems with government aid, as you said, that's where most of the money is, and it's definitely worth putting in a lot of effort to change that. But I also think that it is important to get people to see that there's a distinction between that government aid and the NGO aid. And while not all of the NGOs are doing a great job, that there are some that are doing a good job, and that it's not a hopeless situation. I think if you suggest to people that all of these agencies are no good, it's just a disempowering feeling that they have.
Yeah, no, I don't want to create hopelessness. I want to create pressure for change. That's, an anger at stupid practices that could be, where there's an obvious good practice available that one could switch to, except for political reasons.
Right.
But there's one other practice that afflicts both NGOs and official aid agencies, which is sort of the tradition of thinking that we know the answer, and that I see this in organizations like the Gates Foundations as well as in the official aid agencies, that we think all we need to do is just sort of figure out the technological answer, and we're so good in the West at technology. We know the answers, so all we need to do is just take our superior technology and bring it to these poor people who don't know how to solve their own problems. We know how to solve them, and we fix the problem for them. There's an arrogance and a paternalism in a lot of these efforts that really bothers me, and that's another problem that I wanted to discuss with you, Peter, because I know that this creates tremendous resentment inside Africa. I was just meeting yesterday with a group of African intellectuals, and they were just so angry at the way in which Africa is pictured as this sort of helpless, collection of victims who can't help themselves, just sort of waiting on the white messiahs to sweep in and save them. They're so angry at being treated in this way. And I think that's the other thing that we have to change in the culture of aid, is away from the culture of arrogance and paternalism towards working with people, local people on the ground who do know a lot about solving their own problems. And we have to change the culture to not thinking that we know the answer in advance, but we're going to be searching for the answer with the local people as our guides to how to fix these problems. And that's how the aid money is going to be spent. That's I think another issue that I feel very passionate about, just because it's so morally offensive that we have this superior patronizing attitude.
I'd certainly agree with you that we want to work with local people, with the people on the ground, the grassroots organizations that will know what's the right thing to do. And I think the aid organizations that I support generally do that. I actually wanted to ask you, that reminded me, I did look at your website. I got referred to one page of it, which referred to the Hunger Project. I think you visited something that the Hunger Project did in Ghana, and you wrote something headed something like "Skepticism Takes the Day Off." That project is concerned with helping people to empower themselves, I guess, and solve their own problems. Do you see this as the right way to go?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're giving me a nudge to give some positive examples, because that is very important. That's something that I like to do whenever I go, anywhere in poor countries, is take some time off to go visit some NGOs and just see how they're doing in the field and get a feel for what the problems are. So I actually saw two good projects on that trip. One of them was the Hunger Project, and another was called Women's Trust, that works in a suburb of Accra, Ghana. And the Hunger Project it does very much have the mentality of working with local people, so it does address the issue that I just raised of paternalism. Their idea is very much that local people have to be in the lead. They're going to, just facilitate what local people do. That's the ideal attitude, I think. That you want an effort that's led by local people, and you're just creating opportunities and facilitating things as the NGO. So right now their effort is to build community centers that will do a combination of microcredit and making emergency food available, and there's a schoolroom in the community center. So it's a great effort, and the idea is that the local people are building this on their own initiative at their own pace, and then the Hunger Project supplies some matching financing to help things along once the local people take the lead. And that's really a radical change from traditional aid, because traditional aid is trying to get, official aid in particular is their main objective is make sure that you spend the budget this year. So you have to do things at our pace, the World Bank's pace, not the local people's pace, and that's what leads to a lot of the top down, we know the answer, we're in charge, we'll tell you the answer kind of mentality, because it's so convenient for getting the money out the door. Whereas if you leave the local people in charge, then the money flows at the rate that the local people can use it and need it. And that's a very welcome change that I saw in the Hunger Project. Similarly, the Women's Trust Project is operating in a suburb called Pokuase of Accra, and it's very much a microcredit-based project. But what's great about this project is the NGO leader is a woman who has just dedicated herself to be there on the spot, making sure that everything is working, and then finding out who she can trust and who she can hire to put in charge and take over the project. And she has found Ghanaians who are running the project now locally. She's found, just on the spot, it's a trust-based effort. You need to spend time in the village, know sort of who are the reliable people, who can be trusted to kind of carry the ball, and that's what she's invested the effort to do that. That's, just a remarkable, fresh approach to aid that is so different from the top-down, we send a check from a distance kind of aid.
Right.
It is really working. I saw in Pokuase, I saw a thriving bakery that is employing dozens of workers baking loaves of bread for a larger and larger market, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. And it was all started by Women's Trust, by this woman Dana Dakin, who has just devoted herself to getting this thing going, and now it's going led by local people. So that is the kind of hopeful thing that you can see once we start demanding that there is accountability, that there is an end to paternalism. Then you can get these kind of good things going on, like the Hunger Project and like Women's Trust in Ghana.
Right. Okay. So it's good to know that there are these things that we can support, and that some people are doing things the right way.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned microcredit, I often get asked questions when I talk about this about, a lot of people seem to like the microcredit model better than the donor model. If you like, they like the idea that people are going to take small loans and be entrepreneurial and pay them back.
Right.
Do you think that is generally true, that works better, or are there? I mean, I guess I have a bit of a sense that there are things that microcredit does that are good, but there are also things that you can't achieve by microcredit, that it's not really going to benefit everyone.
Right. Well, the other thing that we have to fight, Peter, is that people demand easy answers, and unfortunately, in the field of helping poor people on the other side of the world, there are no easy answers. So to make an easy answer like, the answer is microcredit. Sorry, it's not such an easy answer. It works. A lot of the time to do a lot of good, and then sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it can break down. There was a story in the Times recently about something a phenomenon I had heard of previously, that what can be happening in microcredit is these high repayment rates that all the microcredit programs brag about could be happening because the old money lenders that were charging super high interest rates that the microcredit programs were designed to drive out have come back into the picture, and they help the microcredit borrowers pay off their microcredit loans using money lender loans. So then they're in the hand of the money lenders, and then they're not going to get out of debt for a long time. So there's always you always have to be aware that a generic answer like microcredit is not. You cannot just say microcredit is the answer and we're done. It's not that easy. I wish it were that easy, but. It's always the devil is in the details. You have to make sure that there are motivated people involved who are making sure the microcredit program, in the particular circumstances, is working, and that's always the bottom line. There is no generic thing that works. What works is you have lots of general things that work a lot of the time, like microcredit or like scholarships or like conditional cash transfers, which are another hot new thing in aid. And, so they work a lot of the time, but to make sure that they work, you need people on the ground to be monitoring what's happening and be making sure that in the end they do indeed reach poor people and allow poor people to support themselves on their own efforts.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I wouldn't disagree with that. And of course, one of the other things that has to be said is that evaluation does cost money.
Yes.
So, I know from talking to Oxfam America and talking to them about evaluating more projects, and they have actually put aside, I think, $3 million, if I remember, in the last year's budget for a program of evaluation. And that's a dilemma to them. That, here's $3 million that perhaps their donors expect them to give directly to programs that are helping the poor, and yet they think they need to do that to evaluate and to make sure that they learn from those programs that don't work so well, so that they can be more.
Right. Well, you're giving a good example of why the idea that having high overhead costs is automatically bad is that's a mistaken idea. You cannot judge an organization by their overhead costs alone, because the overhead costs may be very necessary to make sure that the program is working, and evaluation is an obvious example of that.
Right. So you could have a low number, and you would be giving most of the money to the country that you were helping, but it wouldn't actually be doing a lot of good.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that this is, in a way, is saying we do need more effort going into aid. We do need people to actually support aid more, so that there can be enough to do a proper evaluation, to learn from what works and what doesn't, and then to have the resources to expand and develop programs where they do work.
Right. But remember, it's money alone does not solve the problem. I certainly support your call for giving more, but we have to be clear that the money alone does not solve the problem, even if it's money for evaluation. Because what really makes the difference in the end of the day is the incentives the organization faces. If they get a negative report and nobody cares that they have a negative report on what they do, and people are still giving them money despite them having a negative report because nobody bothers to check up on them, then a lot of evaluation reports will not help, and spending money on evaluation
so we
will
get
not
back
help.
to the importance of a public.
This is educating the public to really change towards this culture of accountability that we've been talking about. That you cannot be content. I loved what you said at the beginning, that you cannot just be content with giving for giving's sake. You have an equally powerful moral obligation to make sure that the giving reaches the poor.
Right. Okay, so if people who are listening to us are thinking about giving still for the holiday season, I guess that's the message that we can agree on. Yes, give, but make sure that where you're giving is somewhere that is effective. As I say, I'd recommend people go to givewell.net, and you've suggested good intentions are not enough.
Yep.
Was that .org, or I don't remember you?
I think if you just Google that phrase, you'll find.
Google good intentions are not enough. You may get some other interesting remarks as well, but you'll find the website too. Okay. So.
And why don't you give another plug for your book, Peter?
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'll hold it up. My book is called The Life You Can Save: Acting Now to End World Poverty. It talks about our obligation to give. It talks about the child in the pond and draws that analogy, but certainly I agree with what you've been saying, Bill, that the real world is more complicated, and I do talk a bit about the complications of the real world, as well as about how little we are actually doing at the moment, say in the United States, and how we could be doing it both more and better. Yeah,
and I'll just give a plug for the blog that I'm running, which is part of a larger effort called AidWatch. It's aidwatchers, all one word, .com. And you can go there if you want to just join the effort to really keep tabs on where aid is going, because that's the issue that we concentrate on. We really think that it's not enough to give. It's equally important to make sure that the money actually reaches poor people.
Okay, and maybe I can mention also, I have a website that's related to the book, has the same title as the book, thelifeyoucansave.com.
Great.
That's a website you can go to. You can pledge to give in accordance with a scale that I talk about in the book, a certain percentage that rises in accordance with your income. You can also find on that links to some of the organizations that I believe are effective, and to givewell.net, where you can follow their recommendations as well. It's in a number of languages if you have friends in other countries who want to do that. And we're expanding and developing the website. We're going to redesign it shortly and try to make it more of a forum where we'll get comments and information from other people in terms of what they think is useful and effective. So please do have a look at thelifeyoucansave.com.
Great. Well,
as well as all these other websites we've been mentioning.
Great. Well, congratulations, Peter, on all your hard work and your efforts to raise the profile of solving the problem of
Thanks
world
very
poverty.
much, Bill, and it's been really good talking to you, and I feel that's it's been really constructive, and we found a lot of common ground.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.